What I'm going to be doing today is talking about trying to understand U.S. foreign policy towards Somaliland via the WikiLeaks diplomatic cables that were released a few years ago. And this is actually drawing from two studies that one is coming out later this summer, one is coming out next year, that looked at 5 different cases: Somaliland, Northern Cyprus, Abkhazia, Transnistria, and Nagorno-Karabakh. If you go to the next one, Mohammed. And I want to give credit here to my co-author, Icky Berg. He's at the University of Tartu in Estonia. Both of these studies were done with him. What I've tried to do today is pull out the most Somaliland relevant or Somaliland focused parts, but I want to give him credit as well. So I want to start with just a basic question. What do I mean by a de facto state? This is a term that I actually coined, or I didn't coin, but I gave prominence to, if you will, almost 20 years ago in my book called International Society and the De Facto State. Other people have used other terms. Some people refer to unrecognized states. Some people refer to states within states, contested states. But I think all of us have a general consensus on some of the key elements defining these things. So first, there's a political leadership that receives some form of popular support. In your case, the government, and the popular support meant to indicate this is not a terrorist group or a militant group that is terrorizing the population, but they're receiving support from the population. Second, it's achieved sufficient capacity to provide governance or governmental services to a defined population. It's actually providing some degree of services. Third, it controls either the territory that it claims or the vast majority of the territory it claims for a period of at least 2 years. And what this is meant to be is some sort of a permanence criteria that, you can't just issue a press release and say we're the sovereign state of whatever and disappear a month later. You have to show some staying power or perseverance. Fourth, the de facto state views itself as capable of entering into relations with other states. It sees itself as a worthy partner of other sovereign states. Related to that, it actively seeks recognition of its sovereignty by the international community. And then finally, it is, however, unable to either receive widespread recognition or, in the case of Somaliland, recognition at all. So it's a place that functions, that exists, that provides governmental services, but is either unrecognized or largely unrecognized by the international community. So at any given time, there are probably 5 to 10 of these things in the world. Current examples include places like Abkhazia, Nagorno-Karabakh, Transnistria, Somaliland, Northern Cyprus. Kosovo and Taiwan are sometimes seen as borderline cases. They share a lot of similarity, but they maybe have a slightly higher or better status. Previous historic examples include things like Biafra or Chechnya or the Tamil Tigers in Sri Lanka. So typically these things are seen as marginal entities, and the typical presumption is that the rest of the international community deals with them in one of 2 ways. Either they ignore them, they don't pay attention to them, or they treat them with hostility. They view them as illegal secessionists and treat them poorly. And what we're trying to do in these studies is, rather than presume that, we are asking the question, how are these entities actually treated? And we're doing so by looking at 544 WikiLeaks cables that were released between 2003 and 2010, and specifically with 5 cases: Abkhazia, Nagorno-Karabakh, Northern Cyprus, Transnistria, and Somaliland. So our data set goes from February 2003 to February 2010. This is basically, in U.S. terms, the second half of the George W. Bush administration, the first 2 years of the Obama administration. And in Somaliland terms, it is basically the Riale administration with our guest Edna as foreign minister for part of that time. She's in the cables. And her successor, Abdullahi Duwale, as foreign minister for part of the other time. So we generated our data set using a specific browser that just searches the titles of the cable. So to get in our data set, it would have to say Somaliland or Abkhazia or Northern Cyprus or whatever in the title of the cable. So we end up with 544 in total. 93 of them are on Somaliland. You can see the others there. Now, if you search these cables on the official WikiLeaks browser, I don't know how official anything with WikiLeaks can be, but if you use their browser, you get dramatically higher figures because their browser searches the word anywhere in the cable. So our 93 cables, Somaliland is in the title. If you just count the word Somaliland, you'll see 449 cables. So how do we know that our 93 are the relevant ones? Well, one example of a NIST cable, one of the ones that's not our 93, that's one of the other 300 and some, is a cable from the U.S. Embassy in Djibouti saying that we've secured agreement to get High magazine distributed as in-flight reading material on Djibouti Airlines, some of whose passengers come from Somaliland. That's the only mention of Somaliland. Another one talks about opening a deaf school on the grounds of the girls' orphanage in Djibouti City and says some of the teachers at the deaf school were trained in Somaliland. So these are not the kinds of cables we're interested in. We're interested in the more substantive, detailed cables. So one of the things sometimes people ask about this is this a legitimate scholarly enterprise? You're using WikiLeaks cables. Bradley or Chelsea Manning, who leaked them, was sentenced in 2013 to 35 years in prison for violating the Espionage Act. So we have a couple of answers to that. Our first answer is we didn't leak the cables, we weren't involved in that operation at all, they're out there. They're in the public domain, whether you think that's a good thing or a bad thing. Second, we believe that these cables are legitimate and invaluable sources of data for a couple of reasons. First, many of them have blunt, entertaining, or in some cases offensive language in them that clearly indicates to us they weren't meant for public release. We think there's some legitimacy to these cables being real cables because if they were thinking about public release, they never would have said some of the things they say. So as an example, a Northern Cypriot mufti was described as a mid-level bureaucrat who couldn't find Mecca with a map. A Northern Cyprus deputy prime minister and foreign minister was described as a nationalist wingnut. Clearly you wouldn't be doing that if you were intending these to be released. Second, there's also some specific information in these cables that clearly indicates to us they weren't intended for release. In the case of Somaliland, one of the cables, they're talking to the Minister of the Interior at the time, and the U.S. diplomat says, well, how do we get in touch with you? And he says, here's my cell phone number. So the cable has his cell phone numbers. Northern Cyprus, there are at least 5 separate cables where someone's name is mentioned and it says, please protect. So this is the equivalent of me saying, I got this information from Rashid Noor, please protect Rashid Noor. I don't want people to know that he's the one who told us, right? And that's in the cable. And then finally, many of these cables, the analysis that's in them is incisive, it's accurate, it's relevant, it's interesting. Clearly the US diplomats are generally pretty well informed. So we coded each of these cables, each of these 544 cables, across a bunch of different dimensions. Was there a direct meeting? Meaning, did somebody from the US meet somebody from Somaliland or talk to them on the phone or email them? Or was there an indirect meeting? They didn't talk to somebody from Somaliland, but they talked to somebody from Britain or Norway about Somaliland. Was there no meeting? If there was a meeting, who participated on the US side? Who participated on the de facto state side? What did they talk about? What was the subject of the discussion? Were the US actions hostile or supportive or neutral, or how did the US seem to be acting here? So I'm going to give you some of our findings. In terms of engagement, we distinguish between direct, which is either a face-to-face meeting or a phone call, direct contact. Indirect, you talk to somebody else. You know, the U.S. talks to Ethiopia about Somaliland, or the U.S. talks to Britain about Somaliland, but doesn't talk to anyone from Somaliland. Or no contact, it's just reporting events. The U.S. the diplomats just saying, you know, Somaliland had local elections and these are the results, but they didn't talk to anyone. So the biggest divide by far that is very, very easy to see in these cables is that the United States directly engages with two of these places, Somaliland and the Turkish Republic of Northern Cyprus, quite frequently. And it does not engage with Abkhazia, Nagorno-Karabakh, or Transnistria nearly as often or nearly as regularly. So this chart here, if you look over on the far, that side, or my left, your right, that last column there is direct meetings with Somaliland. And the next one that's closer to me is Northern Cyprus. And you see both of those, there's a lot of direct contacts. Abkhazia, there's one or two. Nagorno-Karabakh, there's none. So there's Somaliland and Northern Cyprus are talked to. Abkhazia, Nagorno-Karabakh, Transnistria, not nearly so much. Typically, you know, these things are seen as marginal or peripheral actors, but in all of our cases, there is high-level U.S. involvement, in a couple of cases, including at the level of Secretary of State. As examples from Somaliland, Brigadier General Robeson met, I believe it was Edna, I think it was your time, in Djibouti. Commander of the Joint Task Force in the Horn of Africa met Somaliland's foreign minister. And Secretary of State Hillary Clinton intervened directly to ask if Somaliland would receive 2 Guantanamo Bay detainees. Would they be willing to take what we thought were Somaliland detainees back to Somaliland? Fascinating figures here. We had direct contact with President Riale at least 11 times, and I use the expression at least here because maybe there were other contacts that weren't recorded in cables, but at least 11 times. With Edna and with Abdullahi Duale at least 23 times during the period covered by the cables. And perhaps most interesting, particularly for the Humaya people here, we had contact, and the USID people here as well, we had contact with opposition politicians or opposition party leaders at least 17 times. So again, this is during Riale's time, so this is talking to USID or Humaya people in opposition at the time. We have engaged these entities on a wide variety of topics. It's literally everything, water supplies, universities, all sorts of different things. But there's 3 cases where there is clearly one dominant issue. In Abkhazia, it is trying to deny recognition to Abkhazia, the U.S. actively campaigning against recognizing Abkhazia. In Nagorno-Karabakh, it is trying to manage the conflict. And in the case of Somaliland, if you go to the next slide, the dominant issue by far is the 2008 to 2010 presidential election crisis, which, as many of you know, President Riale accurately or correctly feared that he would lose a free and fair election and tried to postpone it, delay it, push it back as much as he could. At the height of this crisis, which under the cables is August to September 2009, maybe some of the people who are on the ground might put the height at a different time, but at the height of this crisis, U.S. diplomats were issuing 11 cables a month about Somaliland's electoral process. So almost once every 3 days, we were issuing cables about Somaliland's electoral process. This was 45% of all of the cables issued on Somaliland. In terms of US support or hostility, the vast majority of the cables we look at are neutral. And what we mean by neutral is they're either reporting events, they're just saying this happened, or sources have told us whatever, and there's no request for action or suggestion for action. But typically it's believed in the literature these entities are treated with hostility across the board. That is not what we found. Go to the next slide. About 1/5 of our cables, just under 1/5 of our cables, we felt we could characterize as either being supportive of the de facto state or hostile to the de facto state. There was a policy that was either quite favorable or quite oppositional to them. And so there's 3 cases that pretty closely correspond to the idea that the U.S. does not like these places, that the U.S. sees these as illegal secessionist entities that are not doing what it wants. They are Abkhazia, Nagorno-Karabakh, and Transnistria. Abkhazia is the most extreme case, 27 hostile cables to 2 supportive cables. Nagorno-Karabakh and Transnistria, 5-to-1 and 3-to-1 ratios of hostile to supportive. In the case of Somaliland, there is almost an evenly balanced number of supportive cables, 13 in our coding, versus hostile, which is 14. So it's almost a 50-50 ratio. In terms of support, one of the big areas where the U.S. consistently expresses support is security and counterterrorism cooperation, anti-piracy cooperation. The other is for Somaliland's continued democratization, for the continued democratic development of Somaliland. U.S. hostility to Somaliland shows up in 2 closely related areas. First, in the arrest of media or journalists and also opposition political figures. One of the cables involving a Secretary of State was arrest of opposition politicians that Condoleezza Rice directly got involved in. The other area where there is by far the most hostility is towards President Riale's repeated postponements and delaying of the election. The U.S. clearly is unhappy with Riale and trying to pressure the administration to hold elections. Some of you guys might recognize Abdullahi Duale in this photo, Edna's successor. This is one of his last 2 or 3 days in office. He was very kind to me, very nice to me while I was in Somaliland. I'm always grateful to him because he secured the invitation for me to go to the handover ceremony from Riale to Solana. One of the cables, one of the most fascinating cables, someone from the Ministry of Interior meets with the U.S. ambassador to Kenya and basically says, here are 8 people that are the core inner Riale administration supporters, right? If you want to hurt Riale, these are the 8 people you want to hurt, one of whom is Abdullahi Duale, and the U.S. ambassador to Kenya says, these people like to travel, these people like to circulate internationally, let's hit them with travel bans, visa bans, asset freezes. Right? That's the extent to which the U.S. is considering going if the election does not get held. Obviously, as all of you know, there's a happy ending to this story. They have the election in 2010. This is Abdullahi Duale on my left, handing over to Mohammed Omar, closer to me in the photo a few days after the presidential handover. So ultimately it works out, but in the meantime the U.S. is actively considering travel bans and visas and asset freezes on this core group of people supporting Riale. So what can we conclude, both in general and about Somaliland? First, I think this says that some of the narrative about how these entities are dealt with is wrong. They are not ignored. They are engaged with some frequency. Go to the next one. We do find some evidence of hostility toward them, particularly with the three post-Soviet cases, Abkhazia, Nagorno-Karabakh, Transnistria. The US generally doesn't like them. It's generally not happy with them. It generally does not support them in any way. This shows up most particularly in terms of Abkhazia, where the United States has a across-the-board coordinated attempt to deny recognition to Abkhazia and South Ossetia. There are cables to Iceland, to Jamaica, to Kyrgyzstan, all over the world saying, please do not recognize Abkhazia. Right? So there is some hostility. Within this context, though, yes, the U.S. does not recognize Somaliland. Yes, the U.S. does not recognize Northern Cyprus. But leaving that to the side, the relations between the U.S. and Somaliland and the U.S. and Northern Cyprus are often quite friendly, quite warm, very seemingly cordial and nice. Continue. So I think there are two main conclusions we can draw about U.S.-Somaliland relations from these cables. First, the U.S. values and appreciates Somaliland's counterterrorism and security cooperation. It also values and appreciates the peace and stability in Somaliland, which benefits U.S. allies in Djibouti and in Ethiopia. The U.S. is very clear and consistent about appreciating that and wanting that to continue. These are a couple of examples of cables where the ambassador to Ethiopia says we should advance counterterrorism cooperation. The ambassador to Kenya says we should advance anti-piracy cooperation. If we cooperate more with Somaliland and Puntland, they'll be able to help us more. If you go to the next one of the most specific examples of the U.S. offering support in this area is the terrorist bombings in Hargeisa in October of 2008. The Federal Bureau of Investigation, the FBI, opens a foreign assistance case, and the U.S. Embassy in Djibouti agrees that any evidence that's collected in Hargeisa related to the bombings can be sent to the U.S. Embassy in Djibouti, where the FBI will help with the investigation. Second, though, I think it's important to note that the United States does not just want a counterterrorism security partner. The United States wants a democratic Somaliland. It is extremely consistent through these cables. I know that our support of democracy is not always consistent. It's not always principled. There are cases where democracy takes a back seat. This is not one of them. The United States wants a democratic Somaliland. This quote from the U.S. Ambassador to Kenya: ensuring Somaliland's continued democratic development should be a top U.S. policy priority for the Horn of Africa. Go to the next one. I think there are two not necessarily mutually exclusive explanations that you can give for why the U.S. is so much friendlier or nicer to Somaliland and Northern Cyprus than it is to the other cases. The first one is what I would call the great power politics explanation, which is the U.S. is allies with Turkey, Turkey's allies with Northern Cyprus, the U.S. is allies with Djibouti and with Ethiopia. Djibouti and Ethiopia benefit from Somaliland's stability, therefore the U.S. is relatively friendly to Somaliland, much more so than it is with cases supported by Russia or Armenia. The other one is what I would call the shared democratic values explanation, that the United States believes that Northern Cyprus and Somaliland have made much more progress in establishing legitimate, viable, constitutionally stable democracies than these other places have. And they are more supportive of them because they appreciate that higher level of democracy. As we move toward presidential elections in Somaliland, and hopefully parliamentary, as Eric was saying earlier, in March 2017, which I hope to go, I hope to be there, I hope it happens, I want to go and see it myself. I think there are a couple of key key findings that come out of this for Somaliland. One is the peace and stability that you have is greatly valued by the U.S., and the U.S. recognizes and appreciates the benefits Somaliland offers to Djibouti and Ethiopia and some of its neighbors. And the second is that the U.S. wants a democratic Somaliland. The U.S. does not want Somaliland to be like any other country in the Horn of Africa. It wants it to be a model, and holding these elections as scheduled, having free and fair elections, if an opposition party wins, having a handover of power, all of those things are arguably very important to U.S. policy. So let me stop there. If anybody has any questions, happy to take them. Yeah?
I'm sorry, what is that plane?
That's the...
Let me explain.
I'll let Edna handle it. Go ahead, Edna. My photo, but Edna can explain my photo.
It's called 444. Do you know why?
I have no idea.
It's a MiG-19, Russian MiG-19, that belonged to the government of Somalia. It will take off from Hargeisa Airport. It will have a 4-minute fly, sortie. It will drop bombs 4 times a day, and the pilots, who were Rhodesians or South African mercenaries, were paid $4,000 per sortie. So 4 minutes, 4 times a day, $4,000 each sortie. Wow. 444. So it's one of the MiGs that were found there and is put out there on the war casualties memorial.
And they dropped it on a civilian target.
Yeah, they took it off from Hargeisa Airport.
Bomb
Take off
Hargeisa.
from Dulles and just bomb us here. That's it. And get paid $4,000 per sortie. Just 4 minutes. That's what it is.
So it's also, in less detail, it's also one of the main monuments in central or downtown Hargeisa.
And let's see if we get.
My question is, do you think there is a door open to put more pressure on the U.S. government to actually recognize Somaliland?
Yeah, you know, it's a good question. There's absolutely no doubt in my mind from reading all of these cables that the U.S. values and appreciates Somaliland in a way that, other than possibly Northern Cyprus, it doesn't value or appreciate any of these other places. You guys clearly have a higher standing, right? 23 times we met with Edna or Abdullahi Duale. That doesn't happen other than in Northern Cyprus, right? Those are the only 2 cases that are like that. So Somaliland clearly, so I guess one finding, if you will, is the U.S. doesn't treat these entities as homogenous. It differentiates and distinguishes between them, and Somaliland is distinguished as relatively more positive, relatively more our friend, and Abkhazia is relatively less positive, relatively less our friend. So there's widespread recognition there. As you probably know, the U.S. policy, which I personally think is gutless, and it's not what I would personally do were I Donald Trump and being nominated. The U.S. policy is that it is an African matter, and that it is up to African states to recognize first. And if and when African states recognize, then the U.S. will be glad to be number 7 or number 8 or number 9 along the line, but it's not going to be number 1. I think it's a disingenuous policy because with Kosovo that wasn't the case at all. With Kosovo we had no problem driving the freight train and telling the rest of the world the freight train is rolling and you can get on it or get run over by it. So I think the best thing Somaliland can do, and I know this maybe isn't what you want to hear, is keep doing what you're doing. Stay peaceful, stay stable, continue to develop as a democracy, continue to develop your economy, continue to be a haven of stability and good governance relatively in that part of the world. And sooner or later, I think that's going to win the day. I don't know if sooner or later is next year, 5 years, 10 years. I wouldn't hesitate, or I wouldn't want to venture a guess on that.
Is there somebody we're afraid? Is there some African country that we're afraid of offending, that we would have made a policy like that, like we're afraid to be the first country to recognize?
Yeah, I mean, again, I think it's a hypocritical policy. We didn't have that policy with Kosovo. I think in some sense there is both white guilt and colonial guilt that, we don't want to be seen as the neo-colonial power telling, poor stupid black Africans what they should do. We want them to decide for themselves, and then we'll go along with it. I also think there's just not a willingness to invest the political capital in it. There are various countries that are more or less supportive of Somaliland's independence, and so far no U.S. president has been willing to, say, sorry Egypt, we're going to go ahead and do this, or sorry Djibouti, you're going to have more competition from Berbera Port and Berbera Airstrip than you do now.
Can I just, little interjection? Sorry. When you get to 78...
Edna's one of my heroes, by the way. I don't mind being interjected on by her.
I think that generation over there should know that Somaliland was the 12th country in Africa to become independent. On the 26th of June, 1960. In fact, on the Independence Day, Madagascar was also getting its independence. Now, in June 1960, when Somaliland became the 12th independent nation in Africa, 42 other African countries were still under colonial rule. Either French, or British, or Portuguese, or Italian. 42. Now, those 42 are today sitting in the African Union and are supposed to decide what to do about Somaliland. When we were independent, they were still under colonial rule. They were junior to us. They got their independence after us. And yet, they are supposed to decide whether or not we should be recognized as an independent state. One. Second thing.
Wait a minute, you didn't explain one. It's because they're jealous of you?
Because they're jealous of us. Because we have peace and stability when they do not.
And they want to show you how...
Now the other reason, to answer your question, why are people not recognizing Somaliland? Are they afraid of something? Yes, they're afraid of Somalia. So we are being punished out of fear of Somalia. Now Somalia, you've said, the plural you, the international you world, has sent peacekeeping forces of 28 nations to try and keep peace in Somalia. And you have failed. The world has failed.
Repeated.
So, why be afraid of a small, fragmented, lawless states like Somalia, when you should be encouraging peace, stability, and democracy, as we have in Somaliland. So stop being afraid of Somalia. They cannot do anything to you. They couldn't do anything to us. So how can they do anything to the most powerful nation in the world? That's my answer.
Yes, go ahead.
Yeah, I think you may also add to your, some of your recommendations that just whoever comes to the Somaliland government leaders must invite, yes, as Edna was saying earlier this morning, representative from Republicans or Democrats to come and see actually what's going on the ground.
They do come.
I just came back from there, and the progress is great. People are really developing, and the city is expanding, both urban and rural. But very little. I work on Capitol Hill, and we hear very little about that.
So let me give you a couple of quick answers to that. 2 or 3 times in these cables, either the U.S. ambassador to Kenya or the U.S. ambassador to Ethiopia is literally begging for permission from Washington, can we please visit Hargeisa, right? We need to talk face-to-face with Riale or Abdullahi Duale or whoever. Can we please have permission to go to Hargeisa? And they are repeatedly being told it's too dangerous, it's not safe, it's whatever. And what I find ridiculous, the story I always tell people, the first day that I got out of the Mansour Hotel, and the Mansour is a lovely place and beautiful people. I love Abdul Qadir Elmi dearly. But every time I wanted something, they'd always say, oh, you don't have to leave, we'll get that for you. You need a cell phone, we'll get that for you. You need to charge your cell phone, we'll get that for you, right? And finally, after about 4 days, I was like, I want to go out, it's like I'm under luxury house arrest here. And so this college student that I met took me into Hargeisa, and it was a Friday, and he said, do you mind if I go to the mosque and pray? And I said, no, of course not, go right ahead. I said, do you want me to wait for you? What do you want me to do? Should I come in with you? Should I wait for you? He said, well, why don't you go to this restaurant and just sit here and order some tea, I'll be back in about half an hour. So there's 3 guys that are there, and they're eating their camel lunch. And what do? They don't attack me, they don't rob me, they don't call me names. They ask me, do I want some of the camel? Do I want to join them and have lunch with them? And then on the way back, he says to me, do you want to hire a car or do you want to take a public bus? And I said, I want to take a public bus. I want to see what that's like. So we get on the public bus. And we start going back, and then he says to me about 5 minutes into the ride, are you okay if I get off the bus before you get off? Because my stop is before yours. And I said, yeah, I'm fine with that, but I don't know where my stop is, so can you please tell the driver or somebody, let me know when to get off? And I hear him speaking in Somali to the driver. And we go another 5 or 10 minutes, and then the driver sort of points at me in the mirror, and he goes like that. And I get off the bus, and I see the hotel is, 2 blocks down the street. Never once felt insecure, never once felt threatened. Nobody did anything mean or bad to me in any way. But the U.S. government, at least in these cables, is like, can we please fly in? We'll meet at the Ambassador Hotel for 1 hour, and then we'll fly out. We won't even go into the city. We know it's bad and dangerous. That perception is there. Now, the Europeans, British ambassador, Norwegian ambassador, whatever, they go to Hargeisa on a regular basis. They're there quite frequently.
Yeah, just to add, your cables were mainly on 2008 and 7. But now, I know where the policy were coming at this state, Mr. Schneider and his groupies were there at that time. But now things are changed. People are, from other nationalities are walking by, and it's very peaceful, and I've seen a lot of Westerners.
No, I know what you're saying, but let me give you an example that Rashid knows, because I talked to him about it. There is, in the United States, a Fulbright Scholars Program, which funds scholars like me, academics like me, to go to foreign countries for a semester or a year. And I asked the woman personally at a meeting, could I go to Somaliland? I have contacts there, I have friends there, could I go to the University of Hargeisa for a semester? You would think she was going to have a heart attack. She was absolutely dumbfounded that I would ask, can I go to Somaliland? And she gave me the name of a person to email, and I emailed the person and said, just want to know, would it be possible to do this? And immediately comes back, no, we absolutely will not send anyone to Somalia at this time. Right? And I had made very clear Somaliland, Hargeisa, University of Hargeisa.
Can you visit me at the subcommittee then? We can find out if you're really serious about going there. the subcommittee can do on Africa.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, without even going to the State Department. Yeah.
Yep.
Next time you want to come to Somaliland, come with a French ambassador.
No. Oh, good.
Without bodyguards,
That's good.
without bulletproof jackets, without military escort. That's the French.
All right, thank you all very much.
Thank you, Professor Scott Pegg, for this wonderful presentation. And there was one thing that Professor Pegg mentioned, the oxymoron of the U.S. policy regarding recognition of nation states. Our policy, and I say our, by birth, I'm a Somalilander, but I'm a citizen of the United States who does not understand the policy of the U.S. towards Somaliland. And Professor Pegg mentioned Kosovo as an example, and why the recognition of Somaliland is pushed to the African nations. Well, when the U.S., my country, wants to recognize someone, they will do so. They did South Sudan, which doesn't even have a colonial history that is different from the greater Sudan. So there is a double standard within the U.S. policy. Maybe the motive was oil or something else, but if they want to, they could have sponsored Somaliland as they did South Sudan. So there's really no explanation for this double standard U.S. policy towards the recognition of Somaliland. Give another hand to Professor Pegg.